Story 1. I was traveling alone in Bangkok, taking a tuk-tuk, an open-air taxi, somewhere. A common scam I had been warned about was drivers making a stop somewhere and locking you in a shop until you bribe your way out. My driver started asking if I was doing any shopping and suggested we stop at his cousin's store. No thanks. He began begging, saying I would really like his store. More emphatically, I said no thanks and asked him to take me to my destination. He said we were just going to stop there quickly on the way. So I waited until he stopped at a red light, then got out and walked away. He was screaming at me to come back, but he could not exactly leave his tuk-tuk in busy traffic. I was not playing those games. Story 2. I was on a train in Berlin. A man was crawling on all fours, barking and growling at people. This is not the weirdest thing for Berlin, but the man's eyes screamed drug-induced psychosis, and I decided to wait for the next train. A few minutes later, I saw police running in because the man had bitten a random woman who was sitting there. Story 3. My cat was lying on my shoulder as usual. Suddenly, he bit me and ran to the bedroom door. I was confused and a little upset. I opened the door and smelled smoke. The microwave was on fire. Story 4. Several years ago, we experienced a flood during spring after a period of intense rain and rapid snowmelt. My father and I were on one of our favorite nature trails when we noticed a river had formed alongside the path, carving out a ravine. Across the ravine, I saw a large tree had fallen after the ground beneath its roots was washed away. Another large tree along the bank looked very vulnerable, as its roots were becoming exposed. I remarked that it would likely fall before the day ended. We stood there for a few seconds longer, and I was fixated on the tree swaying from side to side. Then the tree suddenly went still, and I felt a primal fear take over, prompting me to scream to run. As we fled, I heard it crash down, striking exactly where we had been standing. Later, I learned that large objects falling toward you often do not appear to be moving. I am certain the tree had already started falling, and I had some subconscious awareness of it. Story 5. I was alone and driving to work in my Dodge Omni. Suddenly, I started feeling sleepy, dizzy, and a little sick. I realized just in time, after almost nodding off twice, that I was inhaling exhaust fumes because my exhaust pipe broke directly under where I was sitting. I immediately had to pull over, get out, and call my parents to take me the rest of the way to work while they towed my car. I still think about how many ways that could have ended very badly. Story 6. I was at a party and had too much to drink. The owner of the house let me sleep in the den while everyone else continued to party. There were a few times he opened the door to check on me. Felt like he wanted to see if I was asleep. It made me feel uneasy, so I left discreetly and drove home under the influence. He later sexually assaulted a female friend of his. She got drunk and passed out at one of his parties. Story 7. Not me, but my mother. I was 18 months old, and she was heavily pregnant with my sister at the time. Our washing machine had been malfunctioning, and my mother was holding me as she went to check the laundry. She opened the door, and the floor was covered in water. It was not enough to flood into the hall, but had formed a large puddle. My mother, holding me and heavily pregnant, said she intended to step through the water to see what was going on. However, something told her to stop. She closed the door and called the plumber. The plumber arrived and called an electrician, who immediately turned off all power. The wiring had shorted, and there was a live wire sitting in the water puddle. Had my mother stepped in it barefoot, as this was Australia, she would have been exposed to a lethal voltage which could have killed her and me as I was in her arms. There was nothing unusual about the water, other than it covering the laundry floor, but I am glad my mother trusted her instincts and did not step into it. Story 8. When I was a child, I saw a man pushing his broken-down car, so I helped him push it. He then proceeded to smash the grill open with a screwdriver to get the hood open. That is when I realized I was helping a car thief, so I left quickly. Story 9. My husband and I were at a 24-hour art festival that we attend every year. Around 10:45 p.m., we noticed a group of people arriving and changing the atmosphere. We both decided to leave immediately. A few hours later, there was a mass shooting. 18 people were injured, and the shooter was killed. Story 10. About 2 months ago, I stayed up past my usual bedtime. As soon as I got in bed, I smelled something odd and heard inconsistent banging and clattering from downstairs. I don't live in a great neighborhood, so none of this was unusual, but I got out of bed to check anyway and saw flames licking up the side of the building. I yelled at my wife to get out of bed, threw on some clothes, and we hurried out. Our building shares a wall with the next one, which had an apartment on the ground floor fully engulfed by the time we made it outside. This resulted in condemning the whole building. I was the first person to call emergency services. I have been waking myself up in the night pretty consistently since then. Story 11. In 2002, I was at the Laughlin River Run sitting at a slot machine in Harrah's. I saw a couple of Hell's Angels walk in and told my friend, "Cash out. The Angels are here." He had a confused look on his face when I pushed the button on his machine, grabbed him, and said we had to go. We walked right past a couple of them heading out the door, and we were partway down the hill towards the riverside before the shooting started. Story 12. When my daughter was in 3rd grade, she came home talking about a new friend she had at school called Sally. It was Sally this and Sally that for weeks. Towards the end of the term, she said that Sally was having an end-of-year performance at her church and asked if we wanted to go watch it. We thought, why not? We went to the church to watch it, and almost as soon as we walked in, we regretted it. It was in a warehouse number 1. Plus, someone was clearly assigned to recruit us. A woman named Morgan stuck to us the entire time and kept speaking about the church and its beliefs. They believed that God was a woman, whom they referred to as Mother. We were shown introduction videos for the church and finally shuffled into a room for a family photo. At this point, my husband and I clutched our kids and ran to the nearest door and then to our car to leave. Story 13. Walked into a dive bar in western Pennsylvania and saw a woman in a white dress with a blue flower in her hair. I commented that she must have just gotten married to my group, but no one believed me. I got up from our table to use the bathroom, and when I came back, she was all over a couple of guys in our group who confirmed she was celebrating her elopement. I immediately knew this was going to end badly, so I made multiple comments asking where her groom was. She eventually moved on to other groups, continuing the same behavior. The groom eventually came into the bar, saw her doing this to multiple parties, sat down, and started punching himself in the head. I immediately told my group we needed to get out of there because someone was going to get shot. Right as I said that, the bouncer grabbed the groom and threw him out. The bride and her party followed. I told everyone to hold off until they were out of the parking lot. Not 3 minutes later, a crowd rushed in screaming that someone got shot. The bride shot and killed her own niece, the only family member who witnessed her wedding. Always trust your gut. Story 14. Husband, then boyfriend, and I were living in Oakland at the time, and were catching a Sunday evening Bay Area rapid transit train from the Fruitvale station into the city for a concert. While we were waiting on the platform, I noticed 2 shady-looking men watching us. One appeared to be signaling to a third man standing alone a long way down the platform. When the train arrived, we stepped onto the car directly in front of us and sat down in the front row, immediately beside the 2 Americans with Disabilities Act seats that faced the doors and open area in the center of the car. The shady man and his companion got onto the same car shortly after us, even though they had been standing closer to another car. The shady man sat down in the Americans with Disabilities Act seat directly beside me, his knees nearly touching mine on a nearly empty train. His companion sat down in the second row of seats immediately behind my husband. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and my stress hormone levels spiked, but I tried to calm myself internally and told myself I was just being paranoid. Moments later, the third man, who I suspected the shady man had been signaling to and had been standing far down the platform, stepped onto the same car but remained standing. He started looking up and down the car in both directions, as if assessing the other passengers. In a split second of panic, I placed my hand firmly on my husband's knee, turned to him, looked him square in the eye, and said quietly but firmly, "We need to get off this train. Now." Bless his heart to this day, he didn't hesitate or question me for even a second. We stood immediately and walked briskly through the train car's doors only a second or two before they shut behind us. So close. If there had been any doubts remaining in my mind, they were instantly erased when the shady man sprang from his seat and charged toward the closed doors as the train began to pull away, making eye contact with me the entire time. He then proceeded to walk down the center aisle of the train car as it pulled away, keeping pace with us and continuing to lock eyes with me for the next few eternally long seconds until the train accelerated down the platform. The train entered a dark tunnel immediately after leaving the Fruitvale station, which was also a total dead signal zone. I knew in my gut that the shady man's hands would have been on me and his companion would have had a knife to my husband's throat the moment we entered that tunnel. Only God knows how that would have ended. Shook me to my core. I can still feel the adrenaline surge in my veins just thinking about it. Over 10 years later, I will always be grateful I married the man who didn't even blink when my gut instincts took over. Story 15. My friend and I were about 16 years old. We went to a party, and she got very drunk and passed out in a bed. I went and lay down next to her. Then her male friend came in and told me it was all right and that I could leave. I dragged her out of there by her arms and called our parents to come and get us. Story 16. No, only me. I was young and dumb. I lived in rural Maine for a few years, and I liked hiking alone into its wilderness, particularly to a little stream where I liked sitting while I doodled in my journal. I never told anyone I was going, never carried weapons with me. Generally unwise choices. One day, I was out there and suddenly felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I felt a kind of terror I had never experienced before or since. I am unsure how to describe it. It felt like my mind was receding into a mindless panic, and I had a terrible urge to run. I kept trying to calm myself down. I looked around, saw nothing, and told myself it was my imagination and that I was fine. Then I realized the forest had gone completely silent. The birds and squirrels were hushed. The frogs did not make a sound. Even the insects seemed to have stopped. It was an eerie, deafening silence aside from the stream burbling beside me. I knew at that moment it was not in my head. If all the animals went silent, there was something dangerous nearby. I got up, and it was very hard not to run. My body felt like it was going to bolt at any moment, and I was just barely holding on to self-control. I turned around and walked backward down the trail. It was 2 or 3 minutes. Felt like forever, and I was a decent ways down the trail when I finally saw it. There was a cougar crouched in the underbrush, following me. It was doing that thing cats do when they hone in on you without blinking and slowly creep along. I started talking to it as I continued to walk backward up the trail through the forest. I survived, but that was a wake-up call, and I never went into the forest alone after that. In hindsight, I realized it was likely a juvenile that had not been away from its mother long and had not yet mastered the art of full concealment, or that humans are not supposed to be targets. It was such a beautiful animal, but I had never felt such primal, instinctive terror before. I am glad I left, and I am glad I did not succumb to that overwhelming urge to run. Story 17. Around 2009, when I was 19 and in college, someone messaged me on Facebook saying they found my identification card. He gave me his address and said I could come pick it up. When I arrived, his front door was slightly open, and the television was the only light on. I said, "Hello, I'm here to pick up my identification card." No one responded. I started to push the door open because I was young and inexperienced, but then I realized this was a very suspicious situation and quickly left. When I got home, I messaged him saying I had come by to get my identification card and told him the story, but he never responded. Thankfully, the address on my identification card was still my parents' house in another city. Story 18. Last year, I called Lyft to pick me up from a bar. The car showed up, and it matched the car on the application. I said the driver's name, and he said it was him. Before I got in, I went around the back to check the license plate. It did not match the application. I told the driver his plates did not match, and he told me to get in anyway. I said absolutely not, and he sped off incredibly fast. Story 19. My dad, brother, and I were going through Banff National Park when we saw a van pulled over. Their family was looking into the woods. so we stopped to see if they needed help. It turned out they were throwing rocks into the bushes because they thought they saw a bear and wanted it to come out so they could take a picture. We left there at near record speed. Looking back, I am pretty sure it was Kevin's family. Story 20. Mine is a bit different than most of these since I headed into danger, but it was a good thing. I was around 7 and my cousin was my very best friend. We lived in the same city and had sleepovers regularly. I had never wanted to stay anywhere else but her place. But one time, when my parents were standing at the door saying goodbye, I started crying and said I wanted to sleep at home that night. They tried to convince me to stay and have fun, but I was insistent. I had a medium-sized aquarium in my bedroom that I loved. Anyway, I went to bed like normal but woke up around 3 a.m. I rolled over and the wall behind my aquarium was on fire, pretty much the entire wall. I ran across the hall to my parents' room, woke them up, and they put out the fire before it spread further. It turned out a pebble had been sucked into the filter, jamming it and causing it to overheat, which started a fire at the wall socket. All my fish died, which made me very sad, but my parents are convinced I saved our house and maybe their lives that night. The smoke alarm would not have gone off until most of my room was engulfed, and by that point, there would have been nothing they could do. Story 21. BFE, Wyoming, and my wife is on a dinosaur dig. I have my 2 youngest kids, ages 4 and 6, and we go hiking while she digs. Not far from the vehicles, we reach the top of the tallest hill in the area. We stop to take some pictures and notice my son and daughter's hair standing on end. One of my all-time favorite pictures is of my daughter pointing and laughing at her brother's crazy hair, while hers is standing up as well. As soon as I take the picture, I remember a cartoon from Boy's Life magazine from about 30 years ago about frizzy hair on a mountain, meaning a lightning strike is imminent. I put the phone away, grab both kids, and run off the mountain. We get back to the vehicles just in time to see the storm roll in, and we take shelter from the lightning storm. Could have been much worse. Story 22. Decades ago, I was in Indonesia on a business trip for my Australian cousin who owned a small factory manufacturing camping goods. While leaving the airport in my hired car, I looked around, and the hair on the back of my head began to rise. Little did I know that it was the middle of a revolution, and there was fighting in the streets. My airline deplaned the passengers, and there was no information at the airport, so I had no idea what was happening. While in my car, I told the driver to immediately stop going to the address given by my company and go to the nearest 5-star hotel. Within 30 seconds, I saw burning tires in the middle of the street where people were being dragged from their cars. My driver did a battlefield U-turn at an ungodly speed. You never want to be in a Mercedes making a turn like that. To this day, nobody believes me when I say the G-forces nearly caused me to faint. Possibly because my face slammed into the side window. I gave the driver a $50 tip. I slept in the bathtub of the hotel I checked into while tracer bullets were fired, and explosions were heard around the city. Story 23. Not sure this qualifies, but I will tell it anyway. In 2008, I lived in a housing project for a few months. It was officially me and my friend on the lease, both around 21, but several different young kids as young as 15 lived with us at one time or another. They slept on mattresses on the floor. I locked my bedroom and kept it like a normal home, but the rest of it really just looked like a crack house. Mattresses on the floor, dirty dishes in the sink, alcohol in the fridge. There were gouge marks on my front door that had been painted over. They looked like someone had tried to bash the door in. People were in and out of the apartment constantly, frequently people that had lived in that project their entire life. When a neighbor in a place like that sees that you are having any kind of social gathering, or sometimes even if you are not, often they will more or less invite themselves in and you really cannot risk offending them. One time, a guy I had never seen was suddenly in my living room with 10 or so others we had invited and spent over an hour just fiddling with the sound settings on a boombox sitting in the room. I was positive it was marked for theft, although nobody ever stole it. The police were around a lot. Security for the apartment complex practically lived in our place, and they would call the local police for backup, who would clear people out and then just leave us alone. Rarely or never was anyone arrested. It is possible someone was, and I just was not around that night. I am absolutely positive it was because most of us were white. We deserved to be arrested. Especially me. I was an adult in a crack house full of minors doing drugs and alcohol. My friend came over one time and commented, "What is this? Child services?" Because of how many teens had run away from home to crash at our place for one stretch of a few weeks or another. I kind of shrugged. I knew the whole situation would not last, but I was in a live-in-the-moment time of my life, and the project also happened to be across the street from where I was going to college. One night, I stepped out front for a smoke. So much smoking of everything happened inside the apartment that I did not know why I bothered. I was standing there thinking when I heard a voice call me from my left. There was a staircase to an upstairs apartment stoop at the next building. An old woman was calling to me. I climbed the stairs and said hello. She was probably 70, but black do not crack, so she could have easily been 90, and she asked me to sit down. My spider sense, which was pretty good at that time in terms of the dangers of the project, was not tingling, so I puffed on my cigarette and obliged. Bless this woman's heart. She looked at me with a stern expression and spoke to me like a scolding parent. I will never forget her words. Do you understand that everyone in this place is looking at you right now? Your names are in everyone's mouth. Everyone in here is aware of you. You might as well have a spotlight on you. And this is not a place you want to have a spotlight on you. Something very, very bad is going to happen in that apartment of yours very soon if things continue as they are. You need to leave this place as soon as you can. I told her I would, and I did. Within a few weeks, I moved out of there. I heard from a friend and later read in the news that not long after I left, in that very project, in an apartment around the way, a fight broke out over a missing bag of drugs and guns were drawn. Multiple people were killed in the crossfire, some of them innocent bystanders. It sent a chill up my spine that it could so easily have been my apartment. I will never forget the time I spent in that place, and I will never forget the tough love that stranger showed me. I never even learned her name. Story 24. I wanted to leave but wasn't able to at first. I moved to New York City and had traveled a lot but was still very naive and sheltered. I went to the ferry and met a girl who was very nice but slightly off. Now I know she was probably using drugs. After a minute, when she confirmed I wasn't from New York and had no family there, we were boarding the ferry. Her friend, a good-looking and very well-dressed man, came over. She never said another word. I remember sitting with him, taking the seat next to me with her sitting across. I felt uneasy as we talked, with the hairs on my arms standing up. Then he started complimenting me, and my brain went off. I was very scruffy and tomboyish back then, but I was Wisconsin nice, and they weren't doing anything obviously wrong. So we kept talking even though I wanted to leave. Part of me knew I couldn't fully leave them while on the ferry. The man kept schmoozing and asking me to come to a party with them later. I declined firmly but had never been in a situation like this and didn't know how to shut it down completely. Like an idiot, I gave him my phone number because he and the girl hovered over me while repeatedly asking and then calling it right there. I did have the sense to tell him I didn't really know where I lived since I had just moved. As we docked, I stayed near the ferry worker closest to me and pretended to call a friend while near another worker as they tried to get me to go with them. The man called me multiple times, very oily and complimentary, trying to get me to come out and call him back. The last time, he got mad and ordered me to call him while calling me names. As I grew and learned and became a nurse, I realized how dangerous that situation could have become. I will teach my own daughter to recognize the signs and shut it down firmly. Story 25. I was on Bourbon Street in New Orleans some years ago. Around 11:30, the atmosphere changed. People responded angrily if someone bumped into them. Whereas before, everyone was just like, no problem. Security staff were forcibly removing people into the street, sometimes causing them to fall. I said, let's go. I am not liking this. 20 minutes after we left, a shooting started. 9 people were shot, 2 of them killed. Trust your instincts, people. Story 26. At a house party in college, someone pulled out a katana and said, would you like to see something cool? That was my cue. I grabbed my drink, grabbed my friend, and said, we are leaving before this turns into a streaming service true crime special. Story 27. I was sitting in the parking lot of my then boyfriend's apartment complex with him, smoking a joint at night. He had just gotten a used BMW that was in great condition. The neighboring apartment complex housed many known gang members he grew up with but had to part ways with due to their lifestyle. One gang member in the other complex had the same BMW as my ex in black. My ex's car was not black but dark-colored and looked black at night. I suddenly got a terrible feeling and said, "I think we should go," to which he dismissed my concern. I didn't let it go and said it a few more times until I practically yelled at him, saying, "Let's go right now. I'm not playing games." He reluctantly started to back out of the spot. For spots down, we noticed someone creeping in between other cars in the lot and had to pass him to exit the complex. The guy was holding a short-barreled AK-47 rifle. My ex called his old friends and asked them what was going on. We found out that the man we saw almost killed us because he thought we were the guy from the other complex. Apparently, the intended target had many close calls around that time as retaliation for his actions. My ex sold that car within a week. Story 28. This is back in 1999. My grandfather and grandmother owned a farm with a beautiful old house that dates back to the 1700s. Also located just across from the farmhouse was her pub and restaurant. On this New Year's Eve, everyone was getting ready to celebrate the incoming millennium. By about 7 p.m., the whole village was in the pub and the drinks were flowing, but we kids were starting to get bored and asked to go play the PlayStation in the house. My mother took us down to the house, set the PlayStation up to the television, and told us if we needed anything to just come up to the pub. Then she went back to the party, leaving me at 14, my sister at 10, and my cousin at 14 to our own devices. We played games for hours and eventually got bored of the PlayStation, so we decided to watch a film. This was around 11 p.m. I will set the scene a bit here. This old farmhouse is huge and a bit creepy. It is so old that it had servants' quarters. Over the years, the large double front door stopped getting used in favor of the easy single door for the servants' quarters that leads into the main house. You enter the front door into a long corridor. 3 doors on the left lead to rooms that servants would have used: a washroom, pantry, and storage room. At the end of the corridor, a door leads into what would have been the sleeping quarters, but is now my uncle's man cave. On the right, you enter into the large kitchen, which leads to the rest of the house. We kids were in the living room directly adjacent to the man cave, and we decided to raid my uncle's stash of VHS tapes to find something to watch. I walked through the kitchen into the hall and tried to open the door to his room, but the door was jammed. This room was never locked, but maybe he had locked it to keep us out. I tried the door several times. It opened a little way, not enough to see through, but enough to know the lock was not stopping it from opening. I tried to shoulder barge the door, but it felt solid, like something was behind it. At this point, I gave up and walked up to the pub to tell my mother I couldn't get into the man cave. She came back down to the house with me, and I showed her the door was partially open but would not move. She tried to open it and said, "Oh yeah, that is strange." She tried again harder, but nothing happened. She went back up to the pub to ask my uncle if he had put some sort of lock on the door. Meanwhile, I went into the living room and started swapping the PlayStation SCART cable for the VHS cable. The television back then was enormous, and I was fully behind the television in the corner playing with cables when my mother came back into the house. She walked in and told us there was no lock on the door. Then she went back to the man cave door and started charging at it to get it open. I heard banging noises as she hit the door, and suddenly she shouted, "Everybody out, now!" Immediately, I knew something was very wrong. I could sense the fear in her voice. I scrambled out from behind the television and ran as fast as I could through the kitchen and into the hallway. As soon as I got into the hall, my hair stood on end as I felt a rush of cold winter air blowing through the man cave window and straight through the open hall door. My eyes locked onto the open gun cabinet on the wall and a bookshelf on the floor that was stopping the door from opening. I turned in panic and ran for the pub, but by the time I got there, my mother had already alerted everyone to the break-in, and an endless stream of people ran out of the pub towards the house. Shortly after, we realized the full extent of what had happened. Someone had cut a circle in the glass like you would see in a film and opened the window to get to the gun cabinet. They had stolen a vast array of shotguns, rifles, and some ammunition, but not all of it. Some of the guns were laid on the bed and against the wall. Ammunition was spilled onto the floor, looking like it had been dropped in panic. The police believe the first time I tried to get into the room, I actually disturbed the thieves, and that is what stopped them from taking everything. Even to this day, when I go into that house and see that door, it gives me the creeps, knowing that someone had guns on the other side while I was trying to get in. In summary, my family's farm was broken into while I was in the room next door. Story 29. Halloween night 1989. My ex-wife and I went to Hollywood for fun and people watching. It was extremely crowded. The street was closed down, with police on horseback patrolling the center. We were there for about an hour when I saw a bottle fly out of the crowd and hit an officer. I grabbed my wife and said we had to leave. We had parked on a side street not far from where we were. We made it to the car and left just before the riot started. Story 30. Living in Vancouver and going to college, a friend of mine suggested we go to a house party that another person in our class was hosting. We were both new to the city and wanted to make friends, so we decided to go. When we arrived, the house was absolutely packed. Turned out this guy had 7 roommates, and they all invited their friends. We started drinking and having a good time, chatting and milling around the party. I lost track of time and realized I couldn't find my friend. Wandering around looking for her, as she was a bit of a party animal, I made it to the upstairs bedroom. The ensuite bathroom door was open, and there were people in there snorting something. Inside the bedroom was my friend, heavily intoxicated, lying in a cuddle puddle, as they called it, with 5 guys on either side of her. Some of them were shirtless, and there were empty bottles everywhere. Suddenly, I was completely sober and decided we had to leave immediately. I grabbed my friend, took her bag, and marched her out to the curb where we could get a taxi. I will always be okay with being the party pooper because I am pretty sure I saved my friend from a terrible situation that night. Story 31. Bar scene with some people getting aggressive. I saw one man push another, and I grabbed my friends to leave quickly. Shootings are not uncommon, and the location we were in had no space to avoid any danger. Everyone ran away from the situation. That night ended up fine, but one of the 2 groups shot the other and killed one of them the next night. There were multiple injuries and gunshot wounds. It was probably the worst shooting of this summer so far. We all got together again at a friend's house and talked about it. Initially, I was told I was overreacting by dragging them out of the bar. I received my apologies that night. Story 32. This is a little different, but a friend and I had finished a climb in Estes Park, Colorado. As we pulled up over the top, a wall of storm clouds was coming at us fast. My friend was carefully coiling the rope and organizing the protection gear as the sky started to explode with lightning around us. I suggested, with much emphasis and strong language, that perhaps we should take care of gear organization a bit later. He suddenly realized our situation, and we quickly packed everything into our backpacks and sprinted down as fast as we could. This friend was a very detail-focused climber, which is usually great, but sometimes he had to be snapped out of it. Story 33. My husband and I sold our condo and were closing on a new house in a few weeks, so we rented the condo back until closing. We sold at the same time as another owner, and there were new renters. They were clearly not good people, and it was already scary being around them. Their dog attacked our neighbor's dog and nearly killed her. So we sent our dogs to stay with my parents until we moved. One day, it was over 100 degrees, and they left their dog on their deck in the sun the entire day in a crate with no water. It was a small crate and she was pregnant. The deck is in the sun from 11 a.m. until dark, with the people gone that entire time. Someone called animal control who sent fire trucks and police. I happened to be getting out of my car when they showed up. They asked me to let them in and how to get to Unit X. As I walked up the stairs, which are not in the same area as my condo, I realized they had cameras set up outside their door, so I knew they would assume I had called. I hadn't. I was not home. A firefighter scaled the building, got the dog down, and found the owner. I spoke to the officer who had asked for help and told him I was concerned about the cameras and that they would blame me for calling. He basically said, Why would you be concerned? Later, I went to the police station in tears because I was so scared of what he might do. But the officer said I had nothing to worry about despite the criminal record of this man. A few hours later, I heard someone outside my deck screaming. My husband and I went out and saw the man who lived there waving a gun at me, screaming about what he would do to me. I tried to be calm and de-escalate the situation. Thank God my neighbor heard and called 911, reporting the entire incident. My husband was very panicked but tried to calm the man down. Finally, the man walked off, but we decided right then that we could never live there again. We packed a quick bag, stayed with a friend overnight, I hired help, and came back the next day to pack the entire condo and get a storage unit. We never went back. That night at our friend's house was terrifying. We were so scared because he had done thousands of dollars in damage to both of our cars. The police again said there was no proof. The man was not even questioned for pointing a gun at people. We later heard that he wasn't in his right mind, felt bad, and wanted to apologize. Absolutely not. No thanks. Story 34. Whenever the birds get quiet, or if you are in the ocean and see all the small fish disappear, you leave immediately. Story 35. Not me, but my friend. She was about to get on a tram in our city when she suddenly felt God. She is Muslim, telling her to skip that one and get on the next. She texted me saying she would be late to class. I was not planning to go because I was not feeling well. 2 hours later, I got a call from my dad. He was fine, everyone was safe, but he told me there had been a terrorist attack and someone had killed 4 people on a tram. It was the one my friend skipped. She was on the tram right behind it and had to flee. Netherlands, March 18, 2019. Story 36. Back when I was a part-time bank teller, I got a second job to supplement my income. One of my friends from the first job was having a get-together in the bar district for her birthday and invited me. I was going to go, but I talked myself out of it because it was tax-free weekend, so my second job was going to be very busy. Never before that had I ever chosen not to go out, but for some reason that night, I texted her around 11 to 11:30 p.m. to say I wasn't going to make it, but to have fun and have a purple gecko shot for me. I woke up around 5:30 the next morning, and my phone had hundreds of notifications. That night, around 1 a.m., a man with a figurative axe to grind killed 7 people in roughly 30 seconds in the bar my friends were in. My friends were all fine, ultimately, and I had some survivor's guilt that I had to work through. I still have no idea why I passed on going other than a strange feeling. I was no stranger to staying out all night, running home to change and wash my face, and then immediately going to work. It wasn't work that kept me home that night. Everyone teases me because I talk about that feeling in my belly button and how I refuse to ignore it. But thinking about the consequences still makes me shiver. Story 37. One time when I was probably 16, I was at a house party, kind of a trap house. A friend who owned the house took a phone call, then went into the back room and came back with a shotgun. He said, "Stay away from the windows. Something is going down tonight." We ended up getting out of there as soon as possible because there was some kind of gang war going on and the house had been targeted. Story 38. I was only 20 when one of my blood relatives woke the whole house at 3 o'clock in the morning, claiming they heard someone cut the gas line. It was a full psychotic break. Emergency medical services arrived just before I left, so I didn't feel bad about leaving. I packed whatever I could into the messenger bag I used for school and got out. That was the final straw. I was not about to sit around and watch the situation unfold in real time. My grandmother also lived in the house, and if I had the resources and she were ambulatory, I would have taken her with me. I felt guilty about leaving her there, but she gave me a big hug and a $20 bill and said, "You need to look out for yourself first." Story 39. Not me, but a man my mother worked with decades ago. He and his family were on vacation at the beach. The water started receding far out, and his wife suddenly got up and said she wanted to leave. He and their 2 teenagers objected because it looked interesting. She did not have a concrete reason for wanting to leave. She just had a bad feeling about how the ocean looked. The man said his wife had never done anything like that before, and he figured she didn't feel well, and then the ocean looking so strange just pushed her over the edge with acute homesickness or something. But his wife's behavior was unusual enough that they grabbed their belongings and headed back toward the hotel so she could rest. That is how they survived the tsunami in Thailand in 2004. They barely made it. The wife apparently had no idea why she wanted to leave. Just that something was giving her a bad feeling she had never experienced before. Personally, I assume that at some point in her life, she had learned and mostly forgotten the fact that a tsunami starts with the water receding very far, and when she saw it, she couldn't quite remember learning that fact, but it was just floating around in her subconscious. I recall there were stories of a few people surviving because they had learned about that. Story 40. It was 2010. I had recently moved home and needed a job. I was temporarily staying with my grandmother and uncle. One morning, they gave me a lift into town for a job interview. They went for a wander around the shops while I looked for the shop where I had the interview. It was a nice morning, and I was daydreaming a little as I walked. When I got there, the door was locked, so I knocked. A woman came to the door and said, "There is a madman on the loose shooting people." She looked terrified, and my mind flashed to my grandmother and uncle wandering about. I ran off to find them and realized all the shops were empty. I simply had not noticed earlier. In the end, it turned out we got there about half an hour after he had left. At that moment, when I realized what was going on, my eyes literally bulged. This was in the United Kingdom, where shootings like this are extremely rare. Rest in peace to the victims of Derek Bird. Story 41. My son had leukemia and was undergoing chemotherapy. He was just off for a couple of days. I kept telling his father that I thought we should take him to the hospital. My son had an appointment coming up anyway, and the hospital was a long drive away, so his father convinced me to wait. On the third day, I just knew we had to go. I cannot describe the way I felt. I just knew. I made a scene, started an argument, and screamed until we went. The knowing we had to go immediately was so strong, it was like a fact. My son had a raging ear infection, and his medications were causing an issue with his kidneys. He went straight to the oncology ward for a week and was placed on strong intravenous antibiotics. The doctor later told me my son was so sick that his blood was almost nothing but water. He was in diapers again. One overflowed as he slept and went all over the bed sheets. I had never seen pink urine before or since, and I never want to again. The nurses stopped me from stripping his sheets off the bed and got me to shower my son immediately and wash my hands too. The smell coming from my son made me gag, and I was crying quietly as I washed him so he wouldn't know. I know now that my son had been actively dying, and that smell was death being purged out of him. He recovered in time to be released back home on Christmas Day. I was so stressed out that I spoke to my own doctor to unpack it all. He was so kind and told me that I saved my son's life by following my maternal instinct. My son is now in remission and living his best life. I'm always on edge when he is sick though. Never, ever ignore your parental gut instinct. Story 42. I was invited to a party by an acquaintance I wanted to like more than I actually did. The acquaintance picked me up, and when we arrived at the party, I realized it was just two white men with tattoos and shaved heads drinking beer on a couch, with meth, weed, and more beer on the coffee table. Also, there were the female acquaintance who brought me, a 9-year-old boy in dirty clothes, and me. It was clear I was brought along because the acquaintance wasn't sure about coming alone and had basically enlisted me as a bodyguard without telling me. I sat in a chair uncertain whether it was wise or safe to leave immediately or polite to stay for a few minutes. For about 5 minutes, I just grinned and nodded along without adding anything to the conversation. Then the boy came up to me and said he wanted his parents to come home because his uncle was always like this. I went to the kitchen and looked out into the backyard. By chance, I saw 2 police cars driving toward the street where the house was, between the other row of houses. I went out the back door, through the yard, jumped the fence, and walked quickly through yards and between houses. I walked all the way home, about a 30-minute walk. 2 days later, I found out everyone in that house had been arrested and the boy was placed in Child Protective Services. I never spoke to that girl again. It was the most foolish experience I ever had, and to this day, nearly 20 years later, I do not get into anyone else's car. I drive myself so I can leave anytime I want. Story 43. leaving a friend's apartment late at night around 3 a.m. There is a long corridor to get outside the complex and reach my car across the street. I am about a third of the way through the corridor when I feel someone behind me. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a guy in a hoodie at the beginning of the corridor. I start walking faster and he starts walking faster. Halfway down the corridor, I stop and look directly at him. He pauses for a second, then starts running. I start running too. I burst out of the gate, get in my car, and he is right at my door. Just then, a car turns the corner with headlights shining on us. He looks at the headlights and I floor it out of there. Story 44. A friend and I were first-year university students, and one night we went to an off-campus house party. It started like every other party we had been to there. Lots of drinking, flirting, shenanigans, and people getting too close to the fire pit out back. We knew this place, we knew everyone who lived there, and almost everyone at this party. I started getting a strange feeling. Then I walked around a corner and saw a man standing in the kitchen, casually naked. I turned around, gave my friend a look, and walked out the door at the opposite end of the house with her following me. I found out later that the party turned into an orgy right after we left, and everyone involved contracted sexually transmitted diseases. No judgment. I just did not want to be there for that, and I am glad we left. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.